You're listening to Best Forevers, a podcast for kindred spirits, a podcast that encourages you to love more on your friends and to further consider the issues that plague friendships. I'm Alysa Lucas, and it seems like we might have some light at the end of the tunnel of this global pandemic, but what has been the damage left behind? Today, I have a very, very special guest to talk about some of the things that have happened during the pandemic as it relates to connections, and that is my honor student, Kayla. Hi, Kayla.
Hello. Thank you for having me, Dr. Lucas.
Oh, you can call me Alysa on the podcast. Okay, that might be weird.
Force of habit.
So, Kayla, tell everyone about yourself.
Yeah, well, my name's Kayla, and I am a senior here at CMU, and I am one of Alysa's communication students. So I am a communication major here at the university, and I have minors in event management and leadership. I'm super passionate about building community and connections, which is why I've always been drawn to Alysa's work.
Oh.
So when I was thinking of an honors capstone for my honors program at CMU, I immediately thought of Alysa and the work that she does, because as I was starting to think of this project, the COVID-19 pandemic was starting to unfold. And the first thing that I thought of was how this is going to affect connections and relationships, because that is one of the most important things to me, which is kind of what led me to start asking questions and connecting with Alysa about how this is going to be affecting friendships and connections.
Well, and it's, first off, that was amazing. Good job. She really, in a short amount of time, gave you a lot of information about herself. And I've had Kayla for, is this our four? We've had 4 classes plus.
Yeah, something like that.
Plus this project that we're going to talk about today, and she is graduating, so this is you're all on notice. If you need someone amazing who is amazing in communication, very effective in the way that she communicates, vet management, leadership, a leader, y'all want Kayla, you got to hire Kayla. And if you want me to connect you to her, you can email me at bestforeverspod@gmail.com because I think whoever snatches up Kayla is going to be pretty excited with themselves. And anyone who misses out is going to be crying on their big pillow at the end of each night. So one of the things that I think is particularly cool about this is that when Kayla came to me about this project, it's very, could it be identical in beliefs about what's going on with friendship and connection, right? Friendship has been important to me my entire life. And then knowing that people have such difficulty making friends to begin with, and then you add in a global pandemic, it's immediately a concern about what's going to happen. What does that mean for people? There's so many questions about what the pandemic means for people. And relationships is just, maybe people might even see a small part that can have a huge impact on their life. So I have talked about some episodes related to the pandemic, related to loneliness, and you can find those episodes in the show notes. So there's a 2-part understanding loneliness. There's understanding how to make friends, the pandemic edition, talking about difficulties that friends have with the COVID divide, and thinking about new challenges that we might have as people start to get vaccinated. And so one of the things that I talked about in one of those first episodes comes from the New Yorker, and it's by Jill Lepore. And she says, quote, "We hunger for intimacy, we wither without it," end quote. As humans, we have these basic needs to be met, like the need for inclusion and the need for affection. So it's critical to note the various causes for why such needs may not be met. And in that episode, I talked about a lot of the reasons why people might start to experience loneliness or difficulties because they're not getting those basic needs of connection being made. And so things like changing school or jobs, moving to a new city, ending a relationship, oh gosh, breakups, right? Living alone for the first time. People might have trouble getting to know people. That could be self-doubt, low self-esteem, or social anxiety. And then a number of casual relationships that don't seem meaningful. But one of those things is also working from home. And looking at this list, it's like, hello, quarantine. Hello, pandemic for the last year. It seems crazy that we have met a 1 year anniversary for this. And so, not only do people have this need for connection, what happens is the pandemic has exasperated this epidemic that exists. So, Kayla has been working really hard on this project. It's very exciting. And so today in this episode, we're going to talk about what she did and what she found and what that means, and maybe a little ideas of maybe how we can move forward. So, Kayla, tell us a little bit about what you were thinking in terms of loneliness.
Yeah. So, as Alysa was saying, loneliness has been an epidemic and something Americans have struggled with far before COVID-19 was ever a thing.
Yes.
So I think starting to think about the fact that people are going to be isolated, they weren't going to be leaving their homes, going to work, connecting with friends, like that in my mind was going to be a big concern for people. So I started to think about, like what does research tell us about loneliness? And we know that it has serious implications for our mental health, our physical health. And there's plenty of research that shows that. So as we start to think how COVID-19 was going to start affecting people's loneliness, I was trying to think, how can we do a study that not only is going to show us how COVID is affecting people's loneliness, but also can we start to gather some ideas or recommendations on how people are going to be able to overcome the loneliness that may be imposed on them from their social isolation or from their withdrawing from being in person at their job or with whatever communities they're a part of.
And what's really interesting about this is that, I think we would all say like loneliness exists, that sometimes we feel lonely. Like on Friday night, you're like, do I have any friends? What am I doing? Just watch another episode on Netflix. Like, what's going on? And to me, that's perfectly fine. That sounds like heaven. But I know that there's moments where we experience loneliness, but then we would also expect that the loneliness might increase during the pandemic. And what's neat about this is that you put together a survey to find out what people's perceptions of those connections were. Like, did they have connections? Did they experience loneliness? And so instead of speculating, it's like, let's get out there and find out what was going on with people. So, what was the overall research question that you wanted to answer in this project?
Yeah, so the overall goal was to know how people's level of loneliness had changed during the different phases of the pandemic. Depending on where you're listening from, those phases might look slightly different or the timeline might have been different. But the frame in which we were thinking is pre-COVID as phase one. What were people's levels of loneliness or perceived loneliness? And then that next phase being any phase of shutdown that someone may have faced, when people weren't allowed to go into work, when they weren't able to gather and socialize with others outside of their household. That is what we were considering the second phase. The third phase was under current conditions. So when they were taking the survey, the participants, it was about 3 weeks ago in March. So during that phase, it looks different again, depending on where you are. But at that point, maybe a lot of lockdowns had been lifted, but many people still aren't comfortable leaving their homes or gathering with many people. So we're interested to see how loneliness may have changed from pre-COVID to maybe the most strict lockdowns that people had faced. And then to now in this kind of limbo transition period we seem to be going through with vaccinations rolling out and people starting to gain a sense of normalcy as we enter this 1 year anniversary of COVID.
Yeah. And some people we see, I'm like, can pump the brakes, man. Like you barely got the shot and you're like, that's it, freedom. So I think it goes to show that the last year has been tough for people and and then the sun here in Michigan is coming out. And so those of you who live in places that are sunny all the time, you might not experience this, but this level of like winter where it's gray and it's cold and it's windy and there's snow and you have to shovel and it's right. And then you get that first peak of sun and like that first 50-degree day And there's also vaccines. People are like, let's do this thing. We're ready to get vaccinated. We're ready to go back to normal. And it's like, what is that? We don't know what that looks like now. And as Kayla said, we are kind of in a limbo. And what we might see is that we're finding ourselves in another phase that'd be interesting to have people fill out the survey again as we sort of navigate, because each phase is something new, right? Like this is not something that any of us have experienced necessarily in our lifetime. So that first thing we want to do is like look at those levels of loneliness, how they might change, and looking at some different things of connection and what might have changed with their friendships. So this is where you start to get into like what I call the good stuff, right? So that is like, who are the people that filled out the survey? Like, who were the participants?
Yeah, so this survey had 153 participants. It was open to anyone who was 18 or older, who was English speaking, and who was residing in the United States at the time.
So sorry, friends who are across the country. Unfortunately, you cannot participate because I imagine how the pandemic is handled is different by country. So we felt like that might be a little too far reaching right now. We just first need to understand maybe our own backyard, and then we can move out a little bit further.
Absolutely. And of those 153 participants, a vast majority were female, with 132 female participants and only 19 males.
This is something that has been like an ongoing, like this happens a lot in research, and it's like, what men, let's participate. We want to know what you're experiencing. But yeah, this was a problem I had in like even my dissertation many years ago, where I had to like work really hard to get as many men as possible. So I was a little surprised at how low that number was, but thank you, ladies.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something important to consider even now when looking at research and data. Like, can we really think we're seeing the whole picture if our sample is really only reflecting women's experiences?
Exactly, because like what might they be experiencing? Are they connecting with their friends during the pandemic? Are there any impacts on their friendship? Like, we don't know. And I've talked a lot about on the podcast how men's friendships and women's friendships might operate just a little differently, or they might look a little different, where women might spend more time talking, where men might spend more time doing activities. So with the pandemic, you can talk in so many different ways. You're on text, you're over here, you're on FaceTime, but activities, you might have to be a little bit more creative. And so we might be able to wager a guess what that looks like, but without men participating, we don't get to see it through their point of view, unfortunately. But
yeah, absolutely.
But we had some women. Thank you.
Yes, and of those participants, the ages range from 18 to 78. So a wide range, but the average being around 33. Mm-hmm. So we also had primarily Caucasian participants in the survey. And location-wise, it was majority residents of Michigan, 69.3%, but also there were 22 other U.S. states included, including D.C.
Nice. Yeah, it's probably not surprising that a lot of the folks are from Michigan when Kayla and I shared the survey. And one of the things that we can be certain about is that we did have a stay-at-home order in Michigan. So if the majority of people, that middle phase, we were shut down. So that's something to consider, where other people might have different guidelines to follow.
Absolutely. And then going along with location, there was also a majority of suburban participants. 61.4% of participants were from a suburban area, and then 22.9% from rural, and 15.7% in urban areas.
Yeah. So, I mean, it starts to paint a picture, because all that might have an impact on how we understand these results that we can apply to specifically the sample, right? Thinking about these 153 people. So, one of the things that we did in the study was we wanted to know how often they were connecting with people. And pre pandemic, they connected virtually. This is interesting that over half the sample at 51.6% were connecting daily. And another quarter of the sample at 25.5% was 2 to 3 times a week. And then once a week, 8.5%. So, they were a fairly connected group of individuals. And this might not just be family and friends. This might be thinking about coworkers, neighbors, things like that, people that we have just sort of like quick and casual relationships with. And so that is something that we found. And actually, we also asked, like, what was daily life like pre pandemic? And what Kayla and I found with this open ended question, which means they could write whatever they wanted, that basically people listed all the things that they were doing. It seemed almost like a desperate plea to get back to all of that, all the activities they were doing. And so basically, about 15% of people didn't answer this question, but those who did, the majority of them were busy. And Kayla and I kind of joked when we were talking about this data that it's like, maybe we shouldn't go back to that. Like some of people's schedules, like I get up and then I go do this and then I do that and then I do that and, and I was like, I'm exhausted. But maybe it's being a year working from home that even a commute 2 minutes to campus seems like impossible right now. But they were pretty connected before and they were pretty busy. Only 1.3% said they were not busy. So connected and busy, those were our folks. So what happened during the stay-at-home order?
Yeah, then during the stay-at-home orders, it was interesting to me to originally see that before the stay-at-home orders, people were connecting daily 51.6%. But then during the stay-at-home orders, that dropped to 43.1% of respondents saying they were connecting daily virtually, which I thought was interesting for that to decrease. But as Alysa was saying, that may make sense that people aren't connecting as much with those peripheral, looser ties, like coworkers in the little kitchenette at work, or people that they pass by in the hallway of school. So it would make sense that they're kind of connecting less during those stay-at-home orders.
Yeah, and what's talk a little bit more about those weak relationships, because I know we've had a number of conversations about that. And like, what has that been like for you, maybe even personally? Now, that you've been in the pandemic as a college student for a year now, how have those sort of, we call them weak ties, but that doesn't mean that we don't care about them. They're just not our closest. But tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Like you said, just because they're not are close, that doesn't mean that they're not important. And I think that's something I've definitely realized in my experience through the pandemic. I think something that we have joked about as roommates in my household is that we'll never have a quote unquote class friend again. Like those people that you sit next to in class and you just share like small conversations at the beginning of class or at different points. And those little friendships and those little conversations we have, you start to realize without them that you really are only spending your time and communicating with the people closest to you or the people you live with or the people that you're really investing time into, which I think is interesting later in the survey and in the data too, when we're asking people how their friendships have changed.
Yeah. Yeah. I think about it like I work at home, so there's no hallway conversations. And as a teacher, one of the things is, when I walk into a classroom, I have to set up, but I'm also talking to students and I can see those little friendships happening, or the student who has been absent for a couple days looking for someone maybe to get notes from. And those just like when you work in groups and you connect that way, like there's none of that. There's chat and Zoom. But like that's really like, did that feel sad to you, thinking like you're gonna graduate in May and you weren't able to make any class friends in your last year?
Yeah, it definitely makes me a little sad and disappointed, but I've also started to like recognize and think about that it's not impossible. You do just have to make like an extra effort. If that's a private chat on Zoom to someone that you're like, they said a great thing in their speech today, and just trying to make those connections even when they're not readily available. Like, yes, they're not convenient anymore, but they're not impossible to make. So I think that's something I try to like center when I'm doing virtual work, is that it's still possible. I just have to be more intentional about it.
Yeah.
So that's something I've really been thinking about as I've gone through this semester.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like all of our acquaintances have changed, but I would say that in the last year, because I'm home more, I take Finn for more walks and things like that, that I certainly have developed more with, relationship or friendship with my neighbors or looking to online. So that's the thing is like, even though the pandemic exasperates a loss of connection or not having the same connection, not being able to have those daily connections because we saw a decrease, as you noted, in the stay at home orders. So, like, thinking about we're creating these ties with maybe new people or online, but they're not the same as what we had before. And so I think that leads us into the main part of the quantitative portion of Kayla's study, which is looking at the three phases of the pandemic and looking at the participants' perceptions of loneliness. So we had the pre pandemic, they had the stay at home orders, and then they had current conditions. So, can you talk a little bit now? My listeners should maybe vaguely, just a little vaguely remember the UCLA loneliness scale because I've talked about it before. So, can you talk a little bit and remind them of what that includes and how we used it in your study?
Yeah. So the UCLA loneliness scale is a replicated study that asks participants to reflect on their own perceptions of loneliness with various prompts. And they are asked to do that by using a scale with 4 different options, ranging from I rarely feel this way to I always feel this way. Mm-hmm. And we used this in our study 3 different times. As I was discussing earlier, we wanted to see how their perceptions of loneliness changed through the different phases of the pandemic. So we used the UCLA loneliness scale the first time to determine what their perceived loneliness was before COVID-19. Mm-hmm. We then used it again with how they were perceiving their loneliness during the stay-at-home orders. And then we used it one more time with the exact same questions, just with different tenses, past tense for the stay-at-home orders and pre-COVID, and then present tense to reflect how they were feeling under current conditions. So it's 4 different options to reflect, I rarely feel this way or I always feel this way.
Yeah. And some of the things like some of the items that now the UCLA scale is pretty famous. It's been used quite a bit. It's been used since at least the 80s, since the 80s, everything good came out in the 80s, right? So they started measuring loneliness and it's been revised and it's a 20 item scale. And so the participants, as Kayla was saying, they answered it 3 times, but I think it's important to know it wasn't like 3 times right in a row. Like they had some other questions in between, an open-ended question, some questions about how they stay connected with people, and just a couple examples of the items. Like an item might be, I lack companionship. And then they say like, I rarely feel this way to I often feel this way. There's no one I can turn to. I'm no longer close to anyone. I feel left out. I feel isolated from others. So that is the scale. Typically, those are what the items look like. So then when you add in the pandemic, saying like, before the pandemic, I lacked companionship. During the stay-at-home orders, I lacked companionship. I currently, or under the current conditions, I lack companionship. So the only thing that we did to these items was change what phase of the pandemic it was. So then what we did was a analysis, or repeated measures analysis, to see if there was any changes between the different phases. So Kayla, do you want to talk about the averages for each of them? And so we can talk about the changes that we saw.
Yeah, absolutely. So during those pre-COVID days, we saw the lowest number of perceived loneliness. So the average was about 0.8. So if you think about it on a scale from 0 to 3, 0 being I'm not lonely at all, 3 being I'm very lonely, they were at a 0.8 average, which is relatively pretty low, especially when you're thinking that loneliness is an epidemic. It's something we need to address. It's something we need to fix. So looking at this data and even pre-COVID seeing a 0.8, it kind of took me by surprise to look at and be like, I expected that to be way higher even out of the gate, because we know it's something as Americans that we struggle with. That's an epidemic that we need to confront. So
yeah, I was gonna say, like, you especially see loneliness scores higher for, say, Kayla's age group. Sorry, Kayla, like college age individuals, as well as senior citizens, right? But I also, when I saw that, I was like, I literally sat there and was like trying to figure out the numbers in my head. Wait, what means lonely? What means not lonely? And trying to figure out, was that high or was that low? And it's like, okay, they're not really lonely pre-pandemic. And there's a couple things to consider there. They're reflecting after being in the pandemic for almost a year. So like a year ago, yeah, no, I wasn't lonely at all. Like forget about it. Or we just had people who filled out the survey that are fairly connected. And again, going back to the sex differences, women might have more connections, right? And so I don't know. But that's pretty low. So in terms of an epidemic, it's like, I'm surprised, but maybe that's good news. But then that changed for phase two.
yes, during phase two, which was the stay-at-home orders or any lockdowns, it did increase to about 1.4. So yes, there was an increase in loneliness. People were reporting that they were having more of those feelings of loneliness. But again, it's still relatively low.
Yeah.
It's still under half. Like
Yeah.
if we're thinking of the middle ground of being lonely, they are still below that. So although it increased, it's still kind of surprising that even when people were so distant, even when they weren't leaving their home, that they were feeling that way. But again, they are taking this survey months after even those were taking place. So to really reflect back on that and think, how was I feeling when I was staying at home? That might be influencing how people are reporting their own feelings. Or as Alysa was saying at the beginning, people pre-pandemic were living these busy, exhausting lifestyles. So maybe during those stay-at-home orders, they were like, I'm connecting with people closest to me. I'm not having those peripheral ties, but I am still connecting just in different ways. So
yeah, it seems like maybe some people are like, thank God. Extroverts probably not so much, but there are probably some people like, it's stressful. We don't know what was going to happen in the stay-at-home orders and that sort of thing. But like people are being really creative, like the drive-by birthday parades. The elderly woman across the street had one, and I sat in the front window and I was like clapping and waving at them as they're driving by. It was so much fun, right? It was just, like I'm trying to get in on this birthday connection across the street, right? And so maybe it is a time where they're like, I don't have as many connections. I might feel lonelier, but it's still not as bad as it could be, or that we just had people who feel very connected or are able to find ways to decrease any experience of loneliness. And that brought us to the final or the current phase, which is under current conditions. So what do we see there?
yes. So from the stay-at-home orders to the current conditions, the average loneliness did drop to about 1.2 as an average. So going back down towards the side of not very lonely. So as things are opening up and people are feeling more comfortable to connect with people, we see that their loneliness decreased a little bit from stay-at-home orders, but it is still higher than the zero point 0.8 they were feeling before COVID was even introduced.
Yeah. And when we looked at these three, that the repeated measures analysis showed that there were significant differences between each of these phases in terms of their loneliness. But again, the loneliness scales are on the lower end. But we could see that the lowest score of, or the not feeling lonely, that was going to be pre-pandemic. The next one was the current conditions, but the why can I never say that word? The most lonely, we're going to go that direction. The most lonely they felt were during stay-at-home orders. So so then we also did some open-ended questions, which is always really interesting to see beyond this idea of like you circle a number on a, or you click a button on an online survey and say, this is how lonely I felt. But then we also asked them questions about the decisions that they made related to COVID. So not only looking at how maybe their feelings of loneliness changed over the pandemic, but how are their friendships changing over the pandemic? And so, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the open ended data?
Yeah, absolutely. So we asked them 4 open-ended questions. The first we've kind of touched on, it was asking about their daily life before COVID, in which we saw that everyone, besides about 2%, were super busy going all the time. Then we asked if they had to make decisions on who they'd be spending face-to-face time with during the stay-at-home order phase of the pandemic, and asking how they were making those decisions. Then we asked, considering those decisions, how did they compare with some of their closest friends? Were they having similar reactions and decision-making styles, or were they different? And then the last question asked them to reflect on in what ways COVID-19 has impacted their friendship. So looking at that data, we found some different common themes in people's answers. To question number 2 on how they were making decisions based on who they would see during the stay-at-home orders, we saw some common themes of they saw no one besides their household, or they were only seeing their inner circle. But something we saw quite often is that they were basing their decision-making during the stay-at-home orders on how they were perceiving other people's safety and the decisions that friends were making.
Yes. Friends keeping an eye on friends, right? Like, am I going to get together with you? Not based on your Instagram. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think what was interesting was then to look further into those other questions, like how people were comparing themselves and their decision-making to their friends. So when people were reflecting on if the choices they were making during the pandemic were similar or different to their friends, we coded it with a scale of 1 to 5. So 1 being their decisions compared to their friends were very different, and then 5 being that they were very similar. So we found that the average was about 3.17. So leaning more towards that they were similar, but it was interesting to see that even with that average, that 26.1% of respondents said that their friends' decision-making were different or very different. So a quarter of people were thinking that their friends were making decisions that they didn't agree with or that they wouldn't make for themselves.
Yeah. It's we did have a little bit more in the similarity, but the fact that it fell somewhere in the middle says like people were like, some of their decisions are good, some of them are bad. But so we had groupings of people like you might think friends are similar, so they're going to make similar decisions. And that wasn't exactly the case. And we had the opportunity to read some of their responses, which we have a few here to share with you. So I'll start with the first one and then you can come in with the second one. So this is from one of our participants. It said, I think some of my former closest friends don't like the way that I've handled the pandemic because I haven't isolated myself. But I think that my now best friends and I chose to do was the best decision we could have done. We were already forced to be together at our former workplace. So why not keep each other company outside of it and do movie nights, game nights, and fun stuff at home? I also have actively avoided protests because I think that they were very unsafe gatherings, no matter if people wearing masks or not. And they're referring to Black Lives Matter. A lot of my former close friends were offended by that, even though I chose to put my money where my mouth is with donations instead of attending irresponsible large gatherings. So it sounds like for this person, like very different decisions, and that it says my now best friends have similar decisions that I do. So in this person's comparison, they have former friends and now they have new friends based on the decisions they made, which is, I mean, that's a complete change in friendship. Like people's friendship, this person's friendships have ended and they've started new ones. Oh my goodness. The friendship person in me is like, oh my goodness. Okay, Kayla, do the second one.
Yes, this one is kind of the opposite side of that story, saying that, quote, most of my friends are completely disregarding any kind of social distancing guidelines, whereas I literally do not leave my house except to go to work or the store. A few of my friends limit who they see, which has been my experience. We are very careful about who we hang out with and try to do it socially distanced. A few of my friends and I are more comfortable now eating at restaurants, so we have been able to do that from time to time. So same thing here as well, that at the beginning, it felt as if their friends were completely disregarding social distancing and guidelines that this respondent felt comfortable with. But then again, they found those few friends that were comfortable doing the same things they were, and they've kind of decided together, those few friends that they're going to see, that they're comfortable eating in restaurants. So they've been able to do that together.
Yeah. It's amazing because it's like I guess it goes to show that it makes sense that it might fall with the average, right? Right in the middle, because it's like some of my friends are doing this, some of my friends are doing that. And so we have similar and different, and they're shifting their friendships because of it. So, oh gosh, this one. Okay, it says one of my closest friends, who's my roommate, has been extremely negligent and bringing people who are at risk into our house this whole time, despite me stating how uncomfortable I am. And this has contributed to our relationship deteriorating. My best friend, who I don't live with, is on the same page as me of being careful and having a set a group of people who consistently only see each other so that we can still hang out but not be risk to each other. So, like, that's even harder too, is like thinking about connections. Like, we do make choices, perhaps who we live with, and we might consider those people to be our friends, but they might be making decisions that are risky, and there isn't anything people can do because that's their home. And then having their closest friends who don't live with them making similar decisions. Ugh, I can't imagine, like, for me, like, I feel like I've been very, a lot of my friends, we are similar in our decision making, or they respect my decision making so that we can do things together, social distance, or we Zoom, or, something like that. But so far, these seem like it can be really difficult to navigate. How do you navigate these risky decisions people are making when you live with them, right? So why don't you take the last one?
Yeah, so this last one says that I am much more cautious than people I know. I still do not meet up with people outside my household unless we're outside, distance, and masked. I also made the decision to stay in my parents' home and take classes there, which was a different decision than my closest friends. However, I recognize that everyone's circumstances are different and we are all trying our best.
I think that's a good point. Like, we all are trying our best, but our best might be perceived differently. Like, we might perceive what's best for me might be different than what someone else perceives as what's best for them. That's what I mean. Like, so, but it does cause these like frictions between friends. And so that could have an impact on loneliness, or maybe not, because they found new friends if they didn't make the same decisions as them. And I think that's really fascinating because, like, it's been a year, and it's as if people are not going to wait around for their friends to get it together one way or another, that they're like, well, if that's what you're going to do, I'm going to go find connections elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to then think about how that is going to translate post vaccine, post COVID when we get there. Are those
Yeah.
friendships that were kind of distant, changed, or
Mhm.
cut off during the pandemic ever going to make their way back? Like, after we don't have to consider decision making and risk,
Mhm.
are we going to be able to let these people back in our lives? Or are these going to be relationships that have completely changed and have been severed due to decision making during a pandemic?
I think some of those relationships are going to be severed, and those that try to like sort of reconcile, there we might see people having some difficulties with the reconciliation, because I think it's a surprise to people. And I understand that, like, there are people, everyone is protecting themselves differently, or what they see as protection. And but I think we have this expectation that we are similar to our friends, and so I think it's almost like a shock factor to people to see, like, what decisions their friends are making, and that it's not with consideration to them or to the people around them, or whatever the case might be. And I think, like, people aren't going to forget that. I think that's what's going to be interesting is, and it's not like the pandemic is over. Even after vaccination, we might still be in this for a while, where, quote unquote normal isn't anywhere near being close, even though more and more people are getting the shot, because there are people who won't get the shot, but at some point we might reach immunization. But I think with friendships, because they're voluntary and people feel judged one way or another about their decisions, I think we're going to see people having some difficulties still for the next year or so, or we might see some relationships end. If they can come back together, like what happens, and I hate to say this, it's sort of like knock on wood because I don't want to jinx it, but what happens when there's the next pandemic? Or it might just be in this case, the next variant of COVID-19. So, but the point is there's lots of impact, right? And so that was your last question. So talk about what you found for the last question, how COVID had impacted the friendships.
Yeah, we kind of were already going there without realizing it, that we asked participants how COVID has and the decision making has impacted their friendships from their perspective. So the first respondent had written that, quote, "I've had to cut a lot of people out of my life over the last 12 months. I have no room in my life for people who can't follow guidelines to keep their fellow community members safe. It has made me reevaluate a lot of the relationships I've made and made me a lot more restrictive about the people I allow into my life. I honestly don't think that I would ever be comfortable being friends with someone who I knew went out and partied with a bunch of strangers during a pandemic where 500,000 Americans have died."
Oh, wow. Like that's a pretty powerful statement. And what we might see is that like they're saying like I don't think this is something, this is revealing a value difference, right?
Right.
And I don't think that's something that we can overcome in a voluntary relationship. And so, but it's pretty powerful. That sounds like someone who has decided what their boundaries are and is not going to cross that boundary. We had
Yeah.
another participant that said, "These decisions have sometimes made me less likely to talk with my friends in general for fear of their plans coming up and feeling like they think I'm judging them for being more carefree in their social interactions than I am. It also leads me to feel left out sometimes because those friends will hang out together without asking me to join because they know I'm uncomfortable with that right now. So Felix have been getting closer in the last year and I'm being left behind." Oh, this one breaks my heart because I have like a special spot for people like one of the basic needs is to feel included. And so in a lot of ways people are excluded. And so if it's like we're comfortable going out without masks and being around each other but you're not, is it like more important to go out and do that thing and leave the person behind? Or might you do something and go, I respect that. Let's like maybe we go out, but then the next time we Zoom with this friend, right? This was something that I was talking about with the last episode, the vaccination phase of friendship, is that some people will be vaccinated and other people won't have had the shot yet. And so it's kind of like, don't leave friends behind. Like, we still need to think of creative ways to navigate these things because the change in her relationship is feeling left out. And that does not help for having needs fulfilled, right? And she doesn't want to feel like she's judging them. She just has something different. And we don't have to end relationships because of differences. But, side note, it's okay if you do.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about too that we saw that a lot of people are making different decisions on who they're seeing based on how they're perceiving the other people's decisions to be, and kind of going back to that question of, are people's relationships going to be mended after they don't have to consider that and who they're spending time with? I think there's an important distinction of, are people deciding not to see friends because they don't think they're safe for their health? Or kind of like our first respondent, is it, I'm seeing a value in you that I don't like, and I don't like your decision making because of the principles and values that you're representing more than the worry of my own health if I see you. I think those are going to be two different outcomes after a feeling of safety is restored and seeing people.
Yeah, because how can you be friends with someone that you might not respect? And I think that's what the loss is. Like, it might be a loss of respect one way or another. And it's hard to be around people. Like, why do you want to go to the movies with someone when you don't enjoy their company anymore? Because that's all you can see is like, you went down spring break. Right? You went out on St. Patrick's Day, right? Like, it's a global pandemic, right? So, yeah, I think you're exactly right. So, it looks like we have one person left. You want to grab that one?
Yeah. So this last respondent said, I have lost touch with some people because our relationships were more about convenience than connection. I found that if I'm not able to see them every day, there wasn't much tying us together in the first place. I've grown closer to my close friends during this past year, and we have bonded in ways we couldn't have imagined before.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that goes back to those weak ties, and then people are realizing that maybe people they consider to be really good friends were actually it was because it's convenient. And I was actually listening to the book To All the Boys That I Love, and they were talking about as if it's a podcast, but in the book it was talking about why they were friends with each other in middle school. It's like it's no surprise that it's the person across the street or the person that you sit next to and you're alphabetized, that's how you're set up in the classroom. That's exactly right. There's a proximity factor to creating relationships. And so if there's no proximity, how do you do that, right? And that's the challenge of either not being able to maintain friendships because of the distance, not being able to make new ones, feeling like relationships are over because that proximity is gone. And so it's something that, we might have to be a lot more creative about. Like, how can we create proximity? Like maybe making a Slack channel for your workplace or something if you're all working at home, and you can kind of get those like posts in Slack to it's like a little mini it's not like Facebook, but it's like little rooms where you can chat about things with similar interests, and it might be a great way in which to connect with people. But that is something I didn't anticipate as a friendship person, is like how much we would miss those acquaintances, or that we might realize that we're only friends because of convenience. So it might be that this last year has us thinking about what kind of friends we want and prioritizing the close relationships or the ones that mean the most to us. So maybe one of the things that will come out of the pandemic is that people will be more thoughtful about their friendships, fingers crossed. But what are your thoughts about what we found through your project, right? Like, what are your sort of like, well, now what? Or what does this mean? Or what are your personal reactions to it?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, that we did see an increase in loneliness at different phases. I think that does show that people, even if they had access to technology and Zoom and they were keeping up virtually, that they were still feeling lonely. So I think kind of giving people options on how, like, even though they were connecting, like, how can they do it efficiently? Like, they're not just small talking, being like, how was your day? Because our days all are the same. They're all the same.
There's nothing to talk about.
Yeah. So I think the fact that we saw that loneliness did change over the different phases of the pandemic, and that even if they had access to technology, and that we saw that they were keeping up with people virtually, that they were still feeling increased loneliness, says that maybe we should be looking at how we're connecting with people virtually, and maybe just hopping on a Zoom or a phone call and just asking how someone's day was. That's not sufficient anymore. And that maybe we should be putting more creativity and intentionality behind that. Because I remember reading one of our participant open-ended questions saying, our conversations are so boring now. We have nothing to talk about. So I think that when we're connecting with people virtually, as COVID continues to take place and we are still distant from other people, that we need to be putting thought towards how we're connecting with people in these virtual platforms, and that maybe we should be doing things with people and having shared activities virtually rather than just trying to start conversation and check in with people, and just continue to try and build some normalcy and some memories, and not just try and have conversations that we would have before.
Yeah, it's almost like, there's something about, the daily interactions. Like if you have a text group and you can kind of go back and forth and like, what just happened to me? It's like, guess what Finn just did, my dog, right? Like there still might be a little bit of that, but it's like, guess what I did today? the same thing I did yesterday and the same thing
Exactly.
I did the day before, so it's like, what is there to talk about? And so then it is, like you said, but if we create like a game night and every Saturday night we do a virtual game night where people can share screen on something and people can use their phones to play and everyone's in there having fun, then it's like it recreates something that we do face to face until people are vaccinated. But yeah, we still need to have moments and memories. And although the little stuff is good stuff, like thinking of someone, checking in on someone, sending a meme, all that is good. Like, let's not necessarily get rid of that, but let's not forget that we might all be sitting home on a Friday night, but not everyone enjoys sitting home on a Friday night. So, what can we do to make that a little bit more fun for friends, and being more intentional with the things that we do so we can have these memories, so that we can help maintain a relationship, so we can develop the relationships further. Absolutely. So important. Oh my god. Yay, friendship. So one of the things is like, as a teacher, you're like, okay, like students do cool stuff, but it's even cooler when they come to you and say, hey, I have this idea about things that are happening right now that is not just affecting me, it's affecting everyone. And it's something that you care 1,000% about. And that's exactly what Kayla did. And so maybe what we ended up doing was being able to work on this project was being able to think about these things a lot, but also building sort of our own like professor student relationship. And these might be our weak tie relationships. Instead of seeing me in the hallway, you're like, I'll see you on Zoom. Right. But it's been so much fun to work on this project and being able to work with someone who has all these amazing ideas and wants to see how it turns out. And then like seeing your face when we got the results and like what that might mean is also really fun for a professor. But not only that, like it's critical, like our connections and our ties to people are everything, because if we don't have those things and we feel alone and we don't feel like we matter and we don't feel like there's anyone who is thinking about us, then it doesn't really matter anything else, right? Like
Right.
work isn't enjoyable, any of those things aren't enjoyable. And so really thinking about, there's so many things that we thought about in this world and how the pandemic has changed it. But obviously, our focus here is on relationships. And it's certainly something that we need to continue to think about, because there's probably going to be some level of disruption, disconnection, and some trauma associated without having those connections for at least right now a year. And that continues on. So, Kayla, good job. If I was the honors college, I pass you now. They have the final say, though, right? So I'm so glad you're able to come on, be able to share your findings and your project with the listeners. And listeners, if you have any thoughts or comments about what Kayla has done, if you want to jump in with any of your experiences or what it's been like for you, or when you might have felt like the least connected, what time was that? What are some of the things that you've done to connect with other people? We love to hear about it. You can email me at bestforeverspod@gmail.com. And I'm also Best Forevers Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can find me on alysalucas.com. And here's the thing, a preview. Anticipate if you send in questions about the project or about friendship, Kayla's going to come on the next episode and we are going to answer your questions. We're going to do an episode of Asking for a Friend, the pandemic edition. So you can stay tuned for that. Where a young person and an old person are going to give advice on friendship. Kayla's shaking her head at me. So until next time, friends, think about the ways the pandemic has impacted your friendships and think about being more intentional with your friendships, because without our friends, who would we be? Thanks for listening to Best Forevers. If you like what you hear, be sure to subscribe, rate, review, and of course, share with a friend. Please be sure to follow Best Forevers on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Best Forevers Pod, and I'm at Dr. Alysa Lucas on Twitter. You can always find the podcast webpage for more information at bestforeverspod.com, and share your stories of friendship by emailing me at bestforeverspod@gmail.com. And if you'd like to support the movement to love on our friends more, check out the podcast on patreon.com patreon.com/bestforeverspod. Now, friends, check out this recommended podcast that you must get in your ear holes immediately.
Hey, Upper East Siders. Welcome to Three Gossip Girls, a Gossip Girl podcast.
I'm Liz, an OG fan of the teen series who watched it live back when it aired in 2008.
And I'm Michelle, a newbie to the show, so I have no idea what's to come, including who Gossip Girl is.
What a gem. What a gem. We also had our good friend Ingrid join us for the first season of the podcast as well.
So, if you like ridiculous ship names,
a special drink paired with the episode,
or maybe just hearing old friends dissect this teen drama in all of its glory, this may be the pod for you.
You can join us 30-something-year-olds every Thursday as we unnecessarily dive deep into an episode of Gossip Girl.
We are currently starting season 4 of the show, and we cannot wait for you to hear some fun changes.
More guests, more predictions, and more drama. I mean, this is Gossip Girl after all.
You can find us on all social media platforms at 3 Gossip Girls Pod and listen on whichever podcast platform you enjoy.
XOXO!